Kaieteur Radio.
Guyana is now a full-fledged oil-producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, senior journalist at Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilberg, and tonight we have a very special guest, economist and executive director of the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Richard Rambarran. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much for having me, Kiana. I appreciate the invitation.
Indeed. So without further ado, I'll jump straight into our questions tonight because we have quite a few for you.
Sure.
Now, the oil and gas sector, as we've all observed, brings a unique set of economic opportunities as well as challenges. We've seen this with the impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the impacts coming from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've also seen what's really taking place with policies that are coming forward from the energy transition movement.
Yes.
With all of that, what's your assessment of how Guyana is handling this delicate balancing act?
Thank you very much for your question, Kiana. And I think it's a very important place for us to start, not only as a country, but as now a newly minted oil and gas producer. So excellent question for us to start off with. I'd want to say firstly that when one looks at where the world is going, and you always have to look at the global trajectory and what is happening, we cannot ignore the fact that there is a movement towards sustainable development, and there's a movement that is cognizant of the sustainable energy mix and that energy matrix, which reduces the quantum of fossil fuel that will be used within the context of the global energy mix. However, we as a country, we have articulated a position that, in my view, I think it's good, and I would personally like to say that I'm supportive of that view. I think that there is a space within the international arena for fossil fuels, irrespective of what it is that happens within the global trajectory by 2050. And we've seen that recently with the spike in oil prices as a result of shortage in supply and increase in demand. It means that within the medium to long term, next 10 to 25 years, there will not be a disappearance of oil and gas, or of petroleum rather, within the economic framework. And that in itself lends credence as to why it is that Guyana needs to not just act, but act in a swift manner with its production and ramping up as much production as it can almost immediately. So that is only within the first dimension. Let's call it the first dimension as it relates to sustainable development and sustainable energy mix.
Okay.
Within the second dimension, in my view, when we take it about what has happened historically in terms of polluters and the countries really that have gone through a heavy phase of industrialization without any sort of environmental consciousness, and we know who the industrial powerhouses are globally, but when you look at it, a country like Guyana, whether you take it historically so over a time period in a dynamic sense, or whether you take it at this point in time in a static sense, you will find that Guyana as a country is a carbon sink or a net sequester of carbon. What that does for the country is that it puts it in a very unique position, especially when one advances the rubric of a global market for carbon. So this is to say that if we were to advance a new global economic order by 2050 as it relates to carbon trading, Guyana would already be in a position that it would be one of the leading countries in the world. And it is for that reason that I think Guyana has found that delicate balance already as being a sequester of carbon as well as a producer of oil and gas, a producer of fossil fuel. Now, what underscores our fossil fuel production to be more oriented to mapping into the sustainable development matrix or framework or rubric, whichever terminology you want to apply to it, is the fact that we are producing in Guyana, we have been blessed with light sweet crude. And
Yes.
for that reason, the petroleum itself, as well as the production process or the refinery process to take it to a consumable form, is not as heavy, is not as impacting, or is not as polluting as maybe say in the juxtaposition heavy sour crude. So those three facts for me puts Guyana already on this very delicate balance or very delicate path, which not just Guyana has to walk, but many other countries that find themselves similarly circumstanced.
Thank you very much for that response. And I noticed you brought up the characteristic of Guyana, which has been in the fore, especially recently, which has to do with our net carbon sink status. And the government has been conducting consultations, particularly on the low carbon development
Yes.
strategy, which sort of promotes the value of our forests. So indeed, it's important that you mention that and that continues to be highlighted, because oftentimes we forget the importance, the value of our other natural assets, the forests, in light of the oil and gas reserves that we have. So thank you very much for that. Now, the other aspect I'd like to take you to, my question is, we've heard a lot about the need for Guyana to be wary of being too reliant on the oil money and to not forsake our long-standing sectors. To what extent do you think the recent budgets are ensuring that we stay on this trajectory?
So I want to maybe expand the framework that you have mentioned there, that there ought to be not just a unidimensional view of how we can prevent this natural resources cursed, or a negative impact or some form of economic malaise that may accrue as a result of our extraction of oil and of petroleum or hydrocarbons, in the sense that we have to look at it multifaceted. Firstly, we have to observe what has happened with the institution or the instituting and the reform of the Sovereign Wealth Fund or the Natural Resources Fund. Both of them, of course, being the same thing. That mechanism of the Natural Resources Fund is an extraordinarily important one as it relates to macroeconomic management and smoothing volatility, as well as ensuring prudent financial management of the country. That cannot be understated. Its importance cannot be understated. And I want to say that one of the factors with this natural resources fund that we have overlooked is the fact that we have taken out of the revenue stream gold and the other natural resources that were in the 2019 Act.
That is correct,
And I
yes.
think that that is a particular development within this 2021 Natural Resources Fund Act that is especially important for us. The reason why is that petroleum and petroleum reserves and petroleum extraction and the entire oil and gas sector has its own unique commodity construct when one looks at what happens in terms of international commodity prices. And it is for that reason that I think it is important that we not have the revenue from forestry or the revenue from gold commingling in one fund. It is important that we manage the petroleum sector as the petroleum sector, and we are able to mitigate the volatility and the international price volatility exposures that come along with that sector on its own. The reason why is that if you observe what happened, for example, in 2008 for the global financial crisis or the global recession, you would find that there was a drop in commodity prices, and there naturally was a drop in the petroleum prices also during that period. But if one looks at what happened to the gold prices during that time, it skyrocketed because developed countries obviously want to purchase gold as a commodity for safe haven. Now, if gold revenues are going into the petroleum, the sovereign wealth fund at that time, or let's say hypothetically we had a sovereign wealth fund during a time of recession, and we are investing the petroleum money, the gold money, and all of those revenues into some instrument on the international market, that by itself would remove the natural hedge that gold as a commodity provides, and then exposes us to additional risk. So that is a point that I have not seen been raised in the public domain, and I think that it's a very commendable move by the administration to actually take the other elements of the natural resources revenues that were in the 2019 fund out and just leave it to petroleum. So I just wanted to mention that first dimension of it. Secondly, you spoke about the budget, or you asked me to speak about the budget. I think that the national budget actually allocates a significant amount of money to capital infrastructure and capital works. What capital works does, it's actually about 108 to about 110% of the previous year in terms of expenditure on capital works. What capital works does is that spending has such a multiplier effect in the economy and passes through to every sector, enterprise, worker, subsector, industry in the economy, that for every dollar that is spent on capital expenditure in Guyana, the multiplier effect must be more than $1. So it is defrayed into the economy in a sense that it really benefits overall. So with that alone, as the second dimension, the national budget supporting infrastructure, supporting construction, being the largest in the history of Guyana's, of the entire Guyana, the entire Republic of Guyana, that by itself lends to economic growth and supporting broader economic development. Now, what it does when that happens is that it offsets any sort of impact that might occur from the petroleum sector and through the natural resources curse mechanism, where it may make other sectors uncompetitive, etc. So what we're seeing is that the oil and gas sector is driving growth but then the government expenditure is supporting the counterbalancing or what is called the counter prevailing impact that may cause some sort of offsetting in the economy. So I want to say that overall, the fiscal management that we are seeing within the context of the oil and gas sector in Guyana is one that is commendable. And I want to say that overall, once we continue along this road of supporting construction, infrastructure, and importantly too, the other productive sectors, combined with the Natural Resources Fund and its prudent management, I think that will lead us to a position where we can offset any natural resource curse that will begin to make its way or would traditionally make its way into economies that are similar to ours.
Thank you for that, Richard. I'd like to follow up just quickly on something that you said, and it has to do with a criticism over the years of the government's public sector investment program, PSIP.
Yes.
There's always been an issue of a shortfall, not meeting what has been planned. And in light of that, or on the backdrop of
Yes.
that, there are some who say that perhaps the government, while what it is going for is ambitious, is commendable, perhaps it is too much too soon. And the reason why I also proffer this argument, and I'm seeking your perspective, is because just recently the president was saying that some contractors are saying they can't meet deadlines, for example, because there's a shortage of workers in the construction sector. The boom is just too much. So how would you comment on that in light of the fact that there are concerns about the absorptive capacity of the country to handle all the government wants to do?
You're absolutely correct in that observation, and within the context of Guyana, it's a very important one. I want to mention a couple of things in that regard. Firstly, and of course note that you introduced me as also being the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce, so maybe I'll take the liberty of speaking as a Chamber of Commerce representative too. Firstly, this is the reason why you see organizations like the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce driving assiduously on private sector development. Because when we speak about absorptive capacity of the economy, what we're really talking about is the ability of a private sector enterprise to do work. That's what we're really talking about. How much work can a contractor, can a developer, can someone who's building a road, how much work can they really undertake? And it's for that reason that you'll find that the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry in particular as an advocacy body always is finding various ways to support and promote and advocate and agitate and lobby for enterprises in this country to become more and greater in their capacity to undertake work. That is very important. So that's the first thing. Secondly, as a country, we remain an open economy. We remain an economy that is open to our regional partners under our CSME arrangement, and we remain a country that is integrated into the international architecture, which means that at any point in time, a company can come here. It's for that reason, once again, that you will see an organization like the Chamber of Commerce and the sister organizations always hosting and fielding trade missions. Why? It is important that we understand our limitations in the country, but not just understand them, but work actively towards supporting, promoting, and expanding the companies that may have reached their natural limit or need an acceleration along the learning curve. So that is on that second point. Thirdly, as it relates to the absorptive capacity, if one looks historically in the 2021, and actually if you look at it in the 2022 budget, because they report on the figures for 2021 in the national budget for the successive year. So you'll see revised 2021 as being a table.
Yes.
Have a look at Appendix D of that national budget, Volume 1 of the capital and current expenditure. Have a look at that Appendix D for that first volume, and you'll see that for the first time in recent history, Guyana has been able to reach 100% or very close to 100% of its capital expenditure. And in my view, this is not as a result of happenstance, because there are two elements to when one on the in the finance ministry, when one is undertaking financial management of the country. There is the policy work, where one would set out policy in the budget, but then there is the programmatic work. How much you are able to execute, how much you have set out to execute, then out of how much you have set out to execute, how much you're actually able to achieve. And it is for that reason, Guyana, that it is very important, it is extraordinarily important, and I'm just giving you here the technical underpinning of it, that you have ministers of government, permanent secretaries, prime minister, vice president, president, all out on the ground, driving from first person, driving in person the development of the country. Because it is that and those very simple, quote unquote, actions that will push contractors along, that will push works along. If one takes, for example, what was happening with the Sheriff Mandela Road and the number of years that road was under construction, and I'll point out here specifically, look at what the Ministry of Public Works was doing during the Ministry of Public Works did from maybe the time of about September 2020 up until when the road was completed. It was an extraordinarily great push from the executive branch of the government to be able to get that work done. Now that in itself then reflects programmatically that the government has been able to complete that project pipeline. And that really is how you improve and push for the PSIP, the Public Sector Investment Program, or the capital expenditure works of the government to be completed. So do not underestimate when you see the impact that ministers and permanent secretaries and other technical staff and the executive leadership of the government being out there on the ground. Do not underestimate the impact that it has. And I think that is a fundamental point too that we have to bring out if we are to speak about Guyana's development within the current context.
Thank you for that, Richard. And, your point brings me to the next aspect of our conversation. For those who may not be aware, Richard was one of the key authors of a very important report titled Planning for Prosperity, Labor Migration, and Guyana's Emerging Economy. Richard, I'd invite you to tell us a bit about this report, because it speaks to the importance of us building the workforce that we have to take on the type of development that we're going to need in the next 5-10 years. Yeah. So over to you, Richard.
Guyana, I'll track back a little bit from that report, and I'll tell you what actually inspired me to work along, to have the interest to work along with the United Nations to produce that report. As you know, I'm an economist, and I also lecture at the University of Guyana, and part of my research demonstrated to me that the greatest contributor from an economic modeling perspective, when one models Guyana's economic growth, and you look at the greatest contributor to Guyana's growth, whether it be expenditure on agriculture, expenditure on infrastructure, etc., the greatest contributor to the country is the people of this country and the people that drive the growth. Now, it only serves as a logical extension that if you have a sector that would mammoth your economy in the form of the oil and gas sector, and the capital that is being injected into that sector, the financial capital being injected into that sector, it only serves that you will need, whether for the sector directly or for the supporting sectors, you will need more persons in the country. And what I recognized very early on in the formation of my intellectual thought on it is that we need to ensure that we are channeling the resources from our labor market into productive sectors, and we need to ensure that as many people that can possibly be employed in Guyana, so everyone who is in what we call in labor economics of the working age population, everyone who is within that, we try to get as many persons as we can into the productive sectors. It is also important for us to, in Guyana, improve the labor force participation rate. All right, but even if, and this is what the study would have revealed, even if we take all of the persons in Guyana who are unemployed, underemployed, and even those that are what we call in labor economics again, disguised unemployed, we still do not have enough persons in this country to service the productive or the growth sectors, or where we are intended to grow over the medium term. And that number is about 50,000 persons, 48,500 persons. And it is from that same research that we would have modeled and estimated that based on where we're going in the medium term, we need all of those persons who are unemployed, underemployed, and disguised unemployed. It's a terminology for the listeners. They can check it up. But for all of those persons to enter into the labor market, for them to be in the productive sectors. But we also, in addition to that, need about 100,000 more persons. So we need everyone in this country to have a job, participate in the formal structure of the economy, but also we need 100,000 more people. And I am not sure if it is so, but I saw Foreign Secretary Robert Passad, when he was in Trinidad, would have mentioned that number also. I'm not sure if he got it from the report or if he independently assessed it. But I want to say that is what this study would have revealed. And it is no small wonder. If you are going to have a country that is going to be within the top 20, top 15 producers of petroleum within the next 10 years, or actually it's less now because we're in 2022, within the next 8 years, we absolutely need more people than 750,000 or a labor force of 350,000 to support the country's growth.
Indeed.
So that in substance is what the report was talking about. In addition, it assessed and found that we also need to improve, as a result of the number of persons that we need in Guyana, we also need to improve our institutional capacity to handle migrant labor or migrant workers, because we need to ensure that we digitize the system so that we are able to properly understand who it is that we have in the country. We also need to, and I would have mentioned this publicly several times and in the report, we need to establish somewhat of a labor market information center where we consistently do analysis of what's happening in the labor market, understand the gap that exists between what we have in terms of stock or supply of labor, and then what firms and the government demands. We need to have an ongoing process in an institution or or even a labor market institute or a labor market center that consistently assesses this. And as a result, persons can then understand in the near term, what programs should I study? Educational institutions like the GTI and the other technical institutes and the Board of Industrial Training, they can then know we need to ensure that we up the number of persons that we're taking into this particular program. We need to institute plumbing or a electrical program or something of the sort. We need to ensure that we have a build out of this, capacity improvement. And then even, for example, the government of Guyana can then say, you know, if we require more engineers than we do accountants or economists or attorneys over the next 15 years or 5 years, maybe we should provide grants to persons who are going and do this in the medium term, persons who are now entering into university. So it would serve as a multi-dimensional and a very important institution within the country's landscape, and that is another recommendation or another finding that emanated from this study.
Thank you for that point, Richard. Now, given what you explained, the number of persons we would need to support the development, the explosive development that's going to take place because of the oil and gas resources, and importantly, the time that it will take to bridge the educational gap, because the sector is very technical, it will need a lot of expertise in this regard. Now, considering those two factors, I'd like to ask your perspective on whether you think we run the risk of having an expat-run oil and gas sector. And the reason why I ask this is because Ghana, for example, its local content petroleum commission recently complained or actually noted that even with the plethora of people that they have and the experienced individuals that they have, the fact is that they have an expat-run sector. Mm-hmm. Do you think we run the risk of falling into that category, whether it's for a short time or not?
So I'll say this. Within a country's development, mm-hmm. there can never be any absolute certainty on any particular point. I can never say with complete confidence or with 100% certainty that that will not happen. But what I can look at are the pieces of legislation, the policies that have been instituted, and the general trends that I'm seeing, and then juxtapose that to countries that are similar, that have been similarly circumstanced. And I'd want to say that if that was the report, and this is just anecdotally, if that was the report from the Ghanaian Local Content Committee of the Petroleum Commission of Ghana, that us inviting them to help craft our local content legislation and our entire local content administrative and institutional structure, then it must have been to some credence or to some benefit to Guyana. Because obviously, you would remember that they were here, they were helping the Attorney General's chamber, they were helping the government of Guyana to craft the local content architecture. And therefore, it must be to some credence of us here in Guyana that was the case. But it is hard, Kiana, for me to find that happening in terms of the absolute domination of expat workers, if you will, quote unquote, happening here in Guyana. The reason why is that I am integrally involved in the private sector, and I see that, firstly, since the local content legislation, and secondly, since the government's stance of really being serious about local content and sending credible signals about their support for local content, I have seen that there has been uptake of Guyanese workers, whether it be in management, technical, or just general workers. There has been an increase. Now, obviously, there will be, because this is a sector, remember, we are coming from absolutely nothing, no knowledge of this sector historically, to one of the fastest times from discovery to production within the global history. We're moving rapidly along. So I don't think that it is a case that we are doing badly. I think that we are pushing along. I think that for a country that has moved so rapidly along, Guyanese people, as you know, they're very innovative. They learn very quickly, intelligent people. And we have seen in many of these companies that persons have influential roles, whether they are employees or they have been able to successfully partner or joint venture with a large international company. And this is not as a result of the benevolence of any company or the benevolence of any partner in a relationship. This is as a result of real technical skills and support that Guyanese workers and entrepreneurs can bring to the business and can bring to the entire operation. So I cannot say with absolute certainty that we don't run that risk of having expatriate workers dominating, etc. But I can say that based on the policy that has been implemented, the legislation that has been implemented in the form of the local content, the general trends that I am seeing, and then juxtaposing against countries that have been similarly circumstanced, I must say that we, in my view, are doing fairly well.
Duly noted, Richard. On the local content law, a historic piece of legislation that is now part of the legislative framework that we have to regulate the oil and gas sector. There's a very important issue that I'd like to just have us discuss briefly, and that pertains to companies' access to loans and reasonable interest rates from the banking sector.
Yeah.
Now, as far as we're aware, there are no new developments. The banking sector has not budged, even though the authorities of the day have expressed an interest in having some sort of a reasonable solution being provided where this is concerned. How is GCCI what is GCCI's stance on this matter, and do you believe that the banking sector's failure to budge would hurt the ideals of the local content legislation?
Yeah, so that is perhaps one of the most important points that needs to come out. And I'm happy that you asked it and you hit the nail right on the head. We have discussed in the Chamber of Commerce, and I'll say this because it's something that we feel very strongly about. We have discussed that there cannot be a successful local content regime that helps to lift the standards of MSMEs in Guyana without improvement to access to finance for those same MSMEs. The reason why is that to be able to enter into one of these relations, you obviously have to come with something. Now, you can come with your logistical construct, you can come with your administrative framework, you can come with your knowledge of the landscape, etc. But then when we begin to enter into technical work of the oil and gas industry, for example, or other types of work to support the oil and gas industry, for example, logistics, for example, hotels, and such like, a Guyanese really would need access to finance, and not just access, but also access to cheap finance, so as to be able to be competitive it is no small secret that Guyana is, by virtue of the prevailing conditions, not as competitive as some other countries. So that is no small secret. It is for that reason that since 2006 there was the National Competitiveness Council and other institutions that helped to drive the competitiveness of the economy. And access to finance has been one of those bugbears, if you will, of the local private sector that has really restricted the competitiveness. So, Kiana, to answer the question very plainly or very bluntly, there cannot be absolute success of the local content legislation without cheap and better access to finance. It is just something that absolutely has to occur. Otherwise, we run the risk of our local private sector being unable to compete with our regional counterparts or with our international counterparts. There must be financial sector development in Guyana. There must be financial expansion, so there must be more institutions that offer. And I want to welcome the granting of the banking license to Mr. Floyd Haynes, who is setting up the merchant bank in Guyana. And there must also be financial deepening. There must be more complex instruments being offered. There must be instruments that cater more for what is happening within the modern world, within the modern development of Guyana, the contemporary development. And there also must be some revision of the schedule guidelines that the Bank of Guyana issues. All right, there, because if you look at what's happening, and I'll just touch on one other issue very briefly. It's no small secret that private sector firms are complaining about the length of time that it takes for oil and gas companies to pay. Mm-hmm. That has been something that we've seen, and you've heard. Anyone who is in conversation with any local firm providing service to the oil and gas sector would tell you that. The issue there is that it serves to capture a great amount of working capital that enterprise would have otherwise have. Now, what we need in Guyana, then, is something to bridge that gap. We need something, an instrument, which would provide to an individual who is servicing the oil and gas sector funds up front so that he does not have to eat into his working capital. In finance, it's actually called factoring. So what we need in Guyana is a factoring company where, for example, if you, Kiana, you're the oil and gas company and I'm supplying you, but you want to take 100 days to pay me, but I don't want to wait 100 days, I can go to a third party, I can go to this institution called a factoring company, and they can pay me for every $100 that you owe me, they can pay me $95. And I receive that money up front, and they hold the instrument, and they receive the money from you in the 100 days, and they benefit from the $5 additional. And that is a construct that has worked regionally as well as internationally, but it is something that the schedule guidelines issued by the Bank of Guyana does not allow. So it is something that is a demonstration of the financial sector, a practical demonstration of the financial sector development that we need to happen in Guyana so as to be able to modernize and support the development that comes with concomitant to the oil and gas sector. So there is a lot of work to be done as it relates to the financial sector development, and I am cognizant of the fact that the government of Guyana is moving in that direction. And so, going back to your question specifically, though I went off tangentially there, going back to your question specifically, we certainly need better and cheaper access to finance. so as to be able to fully recognize the benefits that will accrue from local content.
So it's fair to, from what you said, to interpret that you would agree that the banking sector, its failure to budge could be hurtful to the ideals of the local content legislation, as well as the aspirations of our local companies.
Absolutely. There is no question about that. The answer to that very bluntly and plainly is yes. You think about the interest rate, for example, that an enterprise here would have to face versus an enterprise, maybe let's take Trinidad, versus an enterprise in Trinidad. The differential alone in the interest rate and that nominal amount that will accrue from the differential in the interest rate, that alone is enough to wipe out profitability for a local company and thus render the local company uncompetitive. Mm-hmm. We're not even getting Guyana to cost of electricity, which then adds another burden.
Yes.
We're not even getting to maybe the quality and reliability of electricity, which then adds another burden. We're not then talking about the time it takes to open a bank account, which then creates another hurdle. We're not even getting into that. So just at that simple face value, there is need for improvement, and it does go. The stance does go, in my view, and from my assessment, against the spirit and intent of the local content. So it is something that needs to evolve and evolve rapidly if we are to have full recognition of the benefits that will accrue.
Thank you for that, Richard. Now, before we get to the close of our program, there's another very interesting topic that I'd love to have your input in, and it has to do with one recently mentioned by the Vice President, Dr. Barra Jagdeo, as regards Guyana's consideration of a national oil company. Do you think the time has come for us to finally have a say in how we will deal with these resources in terms of being a player, an operator in the market, and having Guyanese have access to that national oil company?
It seems, Guyana, like if you took quite a lot of time in crafting these questions, because they are the topical issues that are extraordinarily important and poignant in the development of Guyana this time. And just to say once again, answer the question very bluntly, yes. I think in my view, the Vice President is correct. We do need a national oil company at this time. And you have seen me in the public domain talk about this too. Mm-hmm. We need to ensure that whether it be that we construct a refinery in Guyana or we lease a refinery in close proximity to Guyana, which of course it's a cost-benefit analysis that you'll have to run on that. But we need to ensure that there is some refinery being done. There is some refining being done of the petroleum that we are extracting. Else, we unfortunately run the risk of the petroleum sector falling into the same trap that the other sectors have fallen into. That is, remaining only primary commodities. We need to transform the commodities into value-added or into secondary and tertiary commodities. So, from that level, from a philosophical, economic development perspective, we need to ensure that we have that in place. So that's the first thing. And whether we lease a refinery or build a refinery in Guyana, it's something that we'll have to work out on, not just a cost-benefit analysis, but what is the economic value that is rendered. I don't want to get into it because it's a topic by itself, but whether the financial risks and costs of building a local refinery and the benefits that accrue from it outweigh that of leasing a refinery from a country nearby. Maybe take, for example, Curacao, or one of the countries that have refining capacity that's not being used. Additionally, however, it is important that we have that national oil company being involved in the refining of petroleum to supply to our domestic market. The reason why is that what Guyanese people feel and experience on a daily basis is not what is being mentioned in the big picture. The big picture will eventually reach down to them. The benefits will eventually redound to the population. But what Guyanese feel, for example, is the price at the pump. And of course, at this time, I must commend government for taking the step to reduce the excise tax to 0%. But what the population feels is the price at the pump. Now, can you imagine, Guyana, if we in this country were to receive refined petroleum available at the pump for cost of production plus maybe a 3 or a 5% add-on to cater for administrative costs? What would that do to the price that every single Guyanese citizen receives at the pump? Now, I haven't run the numbers, but I would reckon that it would perhaps half the price at the pump, which is extraordinarily important to what the everyday person feels. So that is the second dimension of it. So firstly, for an economic development perspective, it's important. Secondly, for what the everyday person feels at the pump. And then I want to add a third dimension that I think has not been spoken about, and I've talked about this within some circles, and I think it's important. I would like to see that national oil company be supported in some way, shape, or form by micro bonds being issued in the local market. And this is also where it ties in with financial sector development. Such that if Guyana has $500,000 or $1 million in her savings, she can purchase a micro bond in the national oil company and be able to receive dividends from this micro bond on an annual basis, or draw advance dividends, and then so every 6 months you would receive some dividends. What that does is that it removes this question as to how am I benefiting from oil and gas? How am I benefiting from anything that's happening here? Because I am able now as a citizen to see two real and tangible benefits from it. One is that my price at the pump might be halved, which will obviously redound to a benefit in my production, my budget, and my personal budget constraint that I have. And then secondly, I can be at a personal level an investor in this. I can benefit from investing in a micro bond in this regard. And I want to say this too, and I just wanted to add it in because I said it's something that I cannot go on a platform like this that has such a wide viewership and not mention it. I've noticed recently, and just permit me to go on a bit of a tangent, but it's interrelated.
Go ahead.
I've seen recently in the public domain the former Auditor General Anand Gulsaran talking about Marriott and what we should do with Marriott and dispensing of Marriott, and that it's a waste of time, etc., for the long and short of it. But it should be perhaps explored that the same construct of raising money regarding micro bonds and floating Atlantic Hotels Inc. on the public exchange here, not just making it a parastatal or a public company, but a publicly traded company, might be one of the ways that we might remove ourselves from having this company incurring debt, etc. So that now Guyanese not only benefit from the profits that would accrue from the national company, but they can also benefit from Marriott Hotel, and then you may eventually raise financing through that same micro bond or the micro bonds to do the casino that was always supposed to be there. So, because it irks me, honestly, to see that type of discussion happening when you have a hotel that has in excess of 90% occupancy, right? And it's one of the most pivotal pieces of infrastructure that this country has. Modern Guyana cannot function without Marriott Hotel. All the conferences, major meetings, major forums, etc. are held there because it's this only space that has the capacity. And to see that it would be thrown out from an intellectual point of view because of someone's lack of innovative thinking on the financial aspect of it, and ignore the other critical elements of economic development that it accrues with it, is something that I really could not allow to go without saying something on it. So I wanted to say that the financial sector development proposition that I was making earlier ties in or maps into this new method of financing, if you will, in Guyana, of this micro bonds. And I just maybe want to throw another one out there of methods of financing. We speak quite often, Guyana, in this country about the size of our diaspora, right?
That is true.
What about floating 1 or 2 or 3 diaspora bonds and have all of these Guyanese who are living overseas, the 150,000 of them that live in New York State, having them take their earnings, and if they want to contribute to Guyana, they invest into the diaspora bond.
Yes,
and we're able to raise capital to do something here.
I've seen a model like that from Nigeria.
Right, and it has worked. And it has worked. So maybe it's something that we also ought to explore here, but I'll just throw that one out there because when we speak about methods of financing, that in itself is a show.
Thank you very much for those comments, Richard. I'm sure that our audience has really learned a lot, and they have quite a number of perspectives to consider, especially on the financial front, which we have not had on the show for quite some time. So really thank you for enriching the discussion with those perspectives. For the concluding aspect of our discussion tonight, I know that the President made some recent appointments to the Natural Resource Fund Board, where the private sector has a representative in the form of Mr. Ramesh Duku. I'd ask you for your comments on that, as well as how you would like to see the NRF board with a private sector representative steer the investment mandate for Guyana, using these revenues to ensure that Guyana realizes this long-touted statement of being the Dubai of the hemisphere.
Yeah, thank you, Kiana. It's very relevant and very topical. I firstly want to say congratulations to my private sector colleague, Mr. Duku, on being appointed to the board. The second thing that I want to say is that the government has gone with an experienced board here for the Natural Resources Fund, and it tells about the seriousness with which this board is being treated with, and its importance within the development framework of Guyana. So that's what I wanted to say in that regard. Secondly, I think the second part of your question was around
how you'd like to see the investment, the board steer the investment mandate and ensure, we realize this dream of being the Dubai of the hemisphere.
So the investment component of the board, and just very quickly, because this can get highly technical very rapidly, but just to say that I'd want to see a percentage of the instruments for the board being invested on the international market in what we call safe instruments that for example, government bonds on the international market, some of the perhaps the short-term investments being in treasury bills that are also very safe, but limiting the total investment of the board, or the total investment of the fund rather, to being in safe instruments. I also then think that a component of the fund should be invested not in risky instruments, but in instruments where there is some degree of return that is over and above what the going rate is for the safe instruments. So if you think about it, you have this total fund as being 100%. I'd want to see that some of that fund, a vast majority of that fund, being invested into safe instruments. Then I want to see a percentage of it being invested into instruments that are less safe but still safe, and they would give you a percentage of return. And then structuring the commodities that one would be investing in, or the various instruments that you would be investing in, to actually run what we say in finance as being counter-cyclical or countervailing to each other. In the sense that when one instrument rises, the other one falls. So that once the rate at which one instrument rises exceeds the rate at which another instrument falls, the country still benefits. And therefore, irrespective of what is happening in the international arena, the country is still able to benefit from a percentage. So overall, I think where we are is that Natural Resources Fund investment committee or investment group ought to look at the way in which the country can obtain a good percentage or rate of return with offsetting or counterbalancing the risk that involves in investing. So a prudent quantum of risk, but still a good rate of return. The reason why I would, and this is just very quickly before I wrap up on this, the reason why I would advise that that board play it quote unquote safely in a general sense, as opposed to going into all sorts of investments. You could take, for example, the Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth fund actually now owns Newcastle Football Club. That is not exactly the safest form of investment. But the reason why I would advise that they go into safe investments is because the structure of our economy, which is why we have to also continue to support sustainable and safe and environmentally friendly mining of gold. The structure of our economy gives a natural hedge to the economic structure. So once you invest that sovereign wealth fund into safe instruments, you have gold production continuing, and you continue to support your productive economies, you'll find that really Guyana can weather just about any storm. And I can say that very confidently as a trained economist. Once we do it correctly, we can weather any storm. And I'm confident so far with what I'm seeing that we will do that. Barring 2020, Guyana's experienced a positive rate of economic growth for at least 2 decades. That is almost unparalleled within the Western Hemisphere. So I think that we understand macroeconomic fundamentals in the country, and we are well poised structurally to do it.
Thank you very much for your contributions to the ongoing discussions on Guyana's oil and you, Mr. Richard Rambarran. We do hope that we can have you back on the program sometime in the future. But indeed, this conversation has been very enlightening, and we'd like to thank you once again for participating and taking the time to share your perspectives. Given all that you've said, it's clear that the oil game really is ours to lose. We're basically set up for success.
Yeah.
if we ensure we make the right decisions and we ensure that we tap the experts and we do what's necessary to protect the interest of the people. To our viewers and our listeners, thank you for continuously participating and being part of the discussion. We hope to see you next week for another very interesting discussion on Guyana's oil and you. Good night, and do continue to be safe. Mr. Rambarran, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Kiana. Good night, listeners.
Welcome to the station where the music blasts through, because life is fun. With 99.